Welcome to Taiwan Talks. I'm Annie Cole. 14 countries have received tariff notifications letters from U.S. President Trump. These nations face tax rates ranging from 25% to 40%. Now, among them, major U.S. trade partners like Japan and South Korea both have 25% tariffs. Laos and Myanmar face rates as high as 40%. At this point of time, Taiwan was not mentioned in the first wave of countries, but how will this tariff battle reshape the future of Asian supply chains? And which country is likely to pay the highest price in this trade war? Joining us today are Yen-Chen Shin, National Chengchi University Political Science Professor, Vincent Chow, Democratic Progressive Party Taipei City Councilor. Welcome to the show, gentlemen. Thank you. Now, as I mentioned earlier, President Trump also signed an executive order extending the reciprocal tariff grace period until August 1st, giving trade partners up to 3 more weeks to continue negotiations with the U.S. So, Professor, I would like to start with you. How do you initially view this newly announced tariff results?
Well, I think there is no discrimination or distinction, among Trump's or U.S. friends and allies, or its opponents or enemies, or not friendly countries.
Right.
Basically, it validated what Kissinger said. It's good to be, it's not good to be U.S. Enemy, but it's worse to be its friends. Means if you are a friend of the U.S., you don't gain anything. Look at Japan and Korea. Strategically so important, trade volume-wise very important to the U.S., yet they still get the 25%. But you look at the other country like Myanmar or even Laos has such a huge reduction, even though that's a small country. But still, you look at them, basically what we have seen is from 25 to 40%. Some countries like Thailand maintain the same. So my view is that if United States wanted to use tariff to reshape the kind of production or supply chain from Southeast Asia or East Asia or Asia-Pacific in general, I don't think it meant to achieve that so far. And if it's have a political purpose of trying to shift the trade volume away from China, it's not achieving that end either. The only thing I feel is that, so far, according to the statistics, maybe Trump has made 14 changes so far since April 2nd, right? The only thing is it makes him look like an emperor because everybody had to come to Washington, D.C. To talk to him, and then almost like, prostrate before him, bow to him. Maybe he accounted that purpose or the other purpose of making Americans feel that they are great again because every country just hurry, on their way to Washington, D.C. and trying to negotiate the deal. But if you look at the deal, it's not much change.
Right, yeah.
So why bothering, to do all this work and get the result like Japan 1% lower than before? That's it.
And Vincent, your view on this?
So I think the biggest takeaway is really Vietnam, because Vietnam has successfully negotiated essentially a rate that was in the 40% range to about half, 20%. And it does show that the U.S. is, I think, quite publicly showering favor on countries that they view had come forward with a good faith effort on negotiating. And so obviously I think Vietnam is a key takeaway. The other countries that have been announced so far, I mean, we haven't seen too much in terms of their negotiations with the United States, like Japan, Korea. I mean, obviously Japan had sent delegations, so had Korea. But essentially, we haven't seen some sort of result from those negotiations. And as a result, you've seen the tariff rate essentially revert to what it was about 3 months ago. So I do think that the Trump administration at this point, they're showing that they do want to conclude these deals, that they do want to see countries put forward, I think, good faith efforts, and they're choosing to reward countries that do. So, there, I think, are numerous lessons to be learned, but I think insofar as what we see clearly right now is that on the case of, for example, Vietnam and the UK, the U.S. has shown that it is willing to come to the table to negotiate these trade deals.
Okay. All right. Before we move on to Vietnam and also the other ASEAN countries that might also be affected, I want to move back to Japan a little bit more. As we're seeing here, that Japanese Prime Minister Ishiba also said that at least it's not your original proposed 30 to 35%.
Yeah.
So he was kind of a little bit more optimistic here. So, Professor, based on what you said earlier, and now we're seeing what Japan's attitude is, and he also said that the U.S. loves to buy Japanese cars. Do you think that within this tariff new negotiated offer and also new negotiated result, do you think Japan's not worried? And do you think Japan is actually okay with the tariff?
Well, we talked about Vietnam earlier, but Vietnam also showed that their import from the U.S. is tariff-free, right? So 0% for U.S. import. But so far, the announced country in Asia, we don't know how much they change their tariff. Tariff rate for American imports. Obviously, Japan worried the most is agricultural products, right, and other electronics. But Japan has successfully resisted U.S. exporting, agricultural product to the U.S. This is a special sector you have to protect. But I think U.S. is adamant about, opening up Japanese market. So this is the rate right now. I think there is still possibility for negotiation.
Right.
That, if somehow Japan would lower its tariff rate on U.S. imports, maybe, the same, the rate will go down a little bit, because so far we don't know yet. And also Japan, so far, if you compare Taiwan currency and other countries' currency, we do appreciate a lot. Japan didn't. So Japan has that advantage, at least right now, versus the U.S., and we really lose that part.
And I wanted to mention that earlier you also quoted Kissinger. So do you think that this tariff will actually affect any of the allies' relationship between the U.S., Japan, U.S., Korea?
Oh, I think right now, Japan probably, it will not affect Japan as much. Japan always counted U.S. as the most reliable ally, and Japan always wary about China. But Korea would be a different story, especially you have a new democratic leader.
Right.
I think President Lee is basically, he said he's going to be neutral, kind of equidistance between U.S. and China, but just taking that position is a loss for the U.S. because if you compare to the previous president, the conservative government is all out to support U.S. and Japan. And right now, just saying I'm in the middle, it would be a kind of loss for the U.S. And I think Japan, at least the current prime minister, is trying to be a more populist, supporting Japan's interest more.
Yeah.
But at the end, I think he probably will have to bow down.
Right. Vincent?
So I think countries have a choice at this point because there's really a lot going on and the situation is really volatile. So I would say that probably there are a number of countries, I'm not sure if Japan's included, but a number of countries waiting and watching essentially what's going to happen in the United States. I mean, there's the midterms coming up, there's inflationary pressure, there's the political sustainability of these tariffs, and obviously there's the added issue that many people neglect, which is the weakening of the US dollar, and that's going to create a lot of new inflationary pressures on the US as well. And so I think there would be countries that would be waiting and seeing and essentially watching what's going to happen in the U.S. politically before they choose to either, as the professors say, bow down or make other decisions on trade and tariffs. And so I think to a certain extent what we've seen from Japan and Korea, South Korea, I think is a bit reflective of that because we haven't seen, for example, them coming right off the bat and saying, we're going to do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8.
Right, yeah.
I think there's a lot of saying, yeah, let's negotiate, let's talk about things. But, as the professor mentioned, there are a lot of core constituencies in Japan that are going to be very, very, I think, watchful of any changes on agriculture, on subsidies, on, for example, tariffs in that matter. And these are core political constituencies for the LDJ. And so I do think at this point that Japan, I don't see that impetus to say that we have to finish something right now, otherwise something bad is going to happen. I do think from the perspective of some people in Japan, they may see that, well, let's wait and see. There's a lot going on.
Okay, and then I wanted to move on to Taiwan for a little bit here. So what do you think might, like Taiwan could leverage on to negotiate with the U.S. in the next round? We'll start with Vincent first.
So I wouldn't say that, I wouldn't use leverage. I would use this. I would say that what we've seen from Taiwan so far, including from what President Lai outlined in his article in Bloomberg a few months ago, including what we've seen in terms of the negotiation team that we sent to the United States to engage with interlocutors there, I would say there is a good faith effort to come to some sort of agreement on trade. And that would be inclusive of a couple things, inclusive of discussions on investment, bilateral investment. It would be inclusive of efforts to remove these long-standing trade barriers, including non-tariff barriers to trade that have long plagued the relationship. I think it will be inclusive of measures on regulatory issues. So I do think there's a pretty holistic effort to engage with the United States. Now, obviously, the situation, Annie, is that we've been pretty clear in terms of what we've been able to offer. I mean, you've seen President Lai talk about LNG investments and so forth. But in terms of what the U.S. actually wants, in terms of what the U.S. has come to expect, in terms of what the U.S. essentially would demand or require for tariffs to go down, I think so far there's a bit of a question mark on that, at least publicly. So I do think that at this point, there is a good faith effort, and we'll probably have to wait and see how the U.S. responds to that.
Right. And Professor, do you have any take on that?
Yeah, I don't think we can go like Vietnam, for tariff-free for U.S. import. If that's not the case, Vietnam got 20%. I don't think we can get better than that. Probably 25 to 28% at least. Similar to Japan or Korea level. But we already appreciate our currency by 12% in the last few months, right? So basically, if it's anything that is lower or higher than 28%, like 30%, down from 32 to 30 or 31, or even 28, we are not gaining. We are not in a good position. So I felt this is what I always be critical of Donald Trump is that Taiwan is supposedly a very important, vital part of your supply chain. Also, strategically, it's a very important part of your containment policy of China, but then we are not rewarded for anything. Instead, he talked about Taiwan being rich, Taiwan being, stealing American technology and all that. So he has demonized Taiwan in a way that he doesn't want to give us the kind of concession I think being a friend, an ally of the U.S. should deserve. So that's why I started with the quote of Kissinger. It means, even though we have been very friendly, very cooperative with the United States, but other presidents might be thinking differently. But Donald Trump is not the kind of president that will say, hey, you're my friend. This is a special favor. Look at Canada. Look at other countries, like, being a neighbor, being such an important ally of the U.S., yet still being punished.
Let me quickly jump in here and say this. I think what's been clear since this re-election of President Trump is that there is no favoritism to partners and allies, and no partner and ally should expect any favoritism on trade. And that's on trade. So I think the strategic alignment, that's a bit different. And the U.S. has made clear that they're not going to tie the things in directly together. So we've seen, for example, Secretary Hegseth talk about security in Indo-Pacific. We talk about reaffirm U.S. commitments there, but at the same time, penalize South Korea and Japan through trade. So I think this administration, what you can see very, very clearly is that there is no friends and enemies on trade. There's just numbers. Right. And so what's important to note is this. So you see these letters that President Trump has essentially unveiled on his X account, right? And you look, they're all copy-paste. I mean, every country is almost exactly the same, right? So you have this letter to, for example, Japan, who's this long-standing treaty ally with the United States, talking about this great country of Japan, the great relationship they have. And you have almost the exact same letter for Laos, or Myanmar, which is ruled by military junta, essentially, talking about the great country of Myanmar and this close relationship. So I would say that at this point, if countries haven't realized this already, they should, but that there's no favoritism on trade. It's purely a numbers game for Trump, and everything's going to be comparative to that. Yeah.
And also following similar deals with the UK and China, as we mentioned earlier, the US has now struck a third trade agreement, which was what we also mentioned with Vietnam. So again, a little bit context, imposing 20% tariff on Vietnamese goods and a 40% tariff on transshipped goods. Now, what this means, it's widely interpreted as targeting China for circumventing tariffs by rerouting goods through Vietnam. So Vincent, I wanted to start with you. When we're talking about the transshipped goods, what exactly are these kind of goods? And could you give a little bit more context about it?
Yeah, I mean, we know this issue well, right? Because it's a common theme in this region, which is that the U.S. has high tariffs for China on for a while now. It's since the first Trump administration. I mean, President Biden has continued this. And so what we increasingly see is Chinese goods essentially wash away their country of origin by rerouting them through countries in the vicinity like Vietnam and like other countries. And, you know, there are some estimates that upwards of half of, for example, of this trade surplus that Vietnam has is through transshipped goods. I mean, these numbers vary according to who you talk to, because all of this is essentially below the surface, gray market for that matter. So I would say the point is the U.S. has shown that it's going to tackle this issue, that it's not going to let it slide, and that they're going to penalize countries that transship goods, and they're going to penalize countries that act as a proxy for China's trade interests, and they're going to do this through these enormous tariffs. So I would say this includes important lessons for Taiwan, because in the past, we've also dealt with this issue. I mean, in Chinese, we call 西产地, right? So we do see, for example, Chinese goods shipped here and then reshipped to other places around the world that have a more favorable trade regime for Taiwan. And so I do think that it's a wake-up call for, I don't think just Vietnam, but all countries in the region, that the U.S. is going to deal with this matter seriously.
And Professor, do you think based on this procedure that the U.S. is doing right now, like what Vincent mentioned earlier, do you think China is going to retaliate against this measure?
I don't think China will retaliate, but China will probably be more smart and sophisticated in doing the transshipping. Maybe, you know, in the past, maybe, you know, you just go through the Vietnam or other country for shipping, but you can do it like 80%, 90% being made in China, and then repack it and redo something, not just package, but, you know, adding some local input in there. And then you have to investigate every Vietnamese product shipping out to the U.S. because there will be some element of China. So this is, I think, the question of globalization. If we have, let's say, automobile before, I remember 40 years ago, we talked about automobile, and then you have cars that they have engine, they have tires, they have electronic, everything is made from a different country. So how, if you don't want anything from China, what's the percentage you would consider as transshipping or as, you know, we call laundering of origin? 80%, 50%, 30%? I think that would be a question. In the future, there will be a lot of dispute on this one, right? So what, of course, 100%, that's no problem. That's transshipment. That's laundering of origin. But what about 80%? What about 60%? If you do hire local workers, if you do use local parts, how do you count that?
So do you think that this could also be, as you mentioned earlier, this could create a lot more disputes, but do you think could also create or trigger a new flashpoint between the U.S. and China conflict in trading?
I think this will, you know, basically what we have seen is U.S. is trying, Donald Trump is trying to use tariff, right, to bring back American manufacturing. But I don't think that's going to happen. You know, some of the competitiveness in the U.S. is in the high tech, it's in the entertainment industry, it's in agriculture, but not in traditional manufacturing anymore. If you don't recognize this one and do not recognize the basic economics of comparative advantage, some products simply are more efficiently and cheaply produced in other countries than in the U.S., then you will have problem, just like Vincent earlier mentioned, there might be inflation for your own country, something you have to deal with. So I think coming back to the original question, that I think most countries will look at Donald Trump. Donald Trump is like, the toy we play, the top, right? You spin the top, and you just have to wait until it stops and to see what's his position, because it keeps spinning. We like 14 times right now. We don't know how many more times he's going to change. Is tariff his end, or is tariff his means to do something?
Right.
But still, I think it's both. But, are you going to achieve the end you want to achieve? Is bringing back manufacturing in the U.S.
Right. So while we're seeing these uncertainty, I also wanted to point out how this is measured against the Vietnamese and also transshipping goods could actually also affect other ASEAN countries, Vincent.
So, ASEAN's facing pretty high tariff rates right now, I think. So, there are limits to how effective transshipment is going to be in the future, because China obviously faces very high tariffs, but there are a lot of ASEAN countries that face high tariffs. And so the differential isn't as big as it was in the past when China was the only country facing high tariffs, and these other ASEAN countries were essentially facing little or no tariffs. So I do think that there are limits. I do think that ASEAN is going to take a very, very close and hard look at this issue, simply because the U.S. has made it a priority. And if the U.S. makes it a priority, I do think that this administration in the U.S., they're going to go through every means to carry it out. So, if we see, for example, in the future, transshipment become a major issue in the Philippines and Laos and Myanmar and other countries, I do think we're going to see some blowback from the United States, probably some penalization in terms of trade. And so countries are going to be aware of that. But I do want to just quickly say, I really struggle to see how China could respond effectively to these U.S. measures against transshipment. China knows that these are bad faith efforts to skirt international rules, and these are bad faith efforts to essentially skirt this international trading regime. And transshipment, I don't think it's an effort that's going to be supported by any country in the world. So I do think that even if China could throw a big fuss about it, in the end, ultimately, I think they would struggle for a way to respond effectively, particularly to something that they're clearly in the wrong for.
Okay, and moving on, this year, the U.S. tightened chip export controls and classified Malaysia as a Tier 2 country. But China also reportedly obtained NVIDIA AI chips through Singapore, and Taiwan's AI-related exports to Malaysia have surged. Critics suggest that Malaysia and similar third-party markets may be becoming rerouting hubs to bypass controls. So speaking of this, I wanted to move on to Professor. What's your take on this?
Okay, Malaysia has almost the same rate as Japan and Korea. So basically, it's not something that China would be able to take advantage of, right? So the only country in the whole ASEAN region or Indo-Pacific region so far right now is Singapore. But Singapore has a trade deficit with the U.S., not trade surplus. Yeah. So Singapore's rate remained 10%. But is Singapore going to be a transshipping place for China? I don't think so. Okay, so just like Vincent said, if you look at other countries, they're all being treated the same. China one time used Mexico, as another place to do that. I'm not sure that U.S. would tolerate that one as well. So it's very difficult. But then toward the end, it's the volume of Chinese basically trade to the U.S. that the consumer goods that the U.S. people, U.S. citizens enjoy affordable price, and that one, if it's going to go up and there is no replacement, then there will be problem. Okay, there might be replacement, but much higher price. So inflation will be a concern, and I know Donald Trump worries inflation the most. Yes. So maybe he will concede again. Maybe he will be tackled again. So we don't know.
And Vincent, what's your take on this? Do you have anything to add onto that?
No, I think Professor Yan said it all. But like Professor Yan ended up with, I think some countries are probably going to still be in a holding pattern for a bit and see kind of where all of this ends up. Yeah.
And I wanted to shift our focus a little bit to the U.S. and India relationship, because the U.S.-India trade talks have stalled over disputes involving the agricultural products and also digital services taxes. Beyond the economic front, as we can see, the two nations are close security partners in the Indo-Pacific and actually share very strong strategic interests in countering China. So, Professor, I'll start with you first. Do you think that this escalating trade tensions could actually affect this relationship between the U.S. and also India?
I think there is a big question right now. U.S. saying, if you're a BRIC country, you're going to add another 10%. And India happened to be the only BRIC country that has probably better relation with the U.S. than Brazil, then Russia, then China, right? And the others. So will India, with that, U.S. effort trying to lure India out of the BRICS, and India look at the kind of economic cost of staying in the BRICS. So this is a question I think we're going to follow for the next few months, because India also want to protect its agriculture as well. And United States always felt India's market is not open to the U.S. The American merchants or politicians like Donald Trump always look at India saying, wow, the biggest population of the world must be a big market for our goods. How can we open it up? How can we knock down its tariff so that we can, really benefit from, the rising consumerism in India? So this is what U.S. wanted. But whether India is a tough negotiator, so I don't think U.S. can get something out of it. Maybe some, but not a lot.
Right, but echoing to what you said, India is a very tough negotiator. And then when in terms of allies, it has its own standpoint. So at this point of time, do you think that this could also actually hurt this strategic cooperation between the two nations?
Well, I think India always liked to use the U.S. as a card to balance its relation with China. So playing the U.S. card is very effective. And China, that's why China also wanted to maintain somewhat a cultural relation with India, because if you don't, India will shift probably toward the U.S.
All right, thank you, Professor Yan, and thank you, Vincent, for being on our show today. We talked from the U.S. to Vietnam and also to other ASEAN countries back to Taiwan on how this trade deal really shakes Asia. Now, once again, thank you, gentlemen, for being on our show. Please press like and also subscribe to our YouTube channel if you like our show. Thank you very much for watching today. We'll see you next time.